Hello, and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where I shall be continuing my narrative of the decline and fall of the Roman Republic and finishing the mini-series, the three-part series on the life of Cato the Younger. So if you remember last time, I left off just about when Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, and Pompey and Cato and Cicero and a lot of the leading optimates of Rome had fled before Caesar's legion. And so I'll pick up the story there. Now, what it seems like is that Cato was very much a patriot. That's a bit of a modern word, but he was more of a patriot than he was a partisan. In other words, when it came to the crunch, the actual final moments, the final political movements and machinations, he decided it would be best to let Pompey be the first most eminent man in Rome rather than have anarchy. He also thought, right in the last moments, that it would be best to let Caesar be the undisputed man in Rome rather than a civil war. It seems that Cato's view was that a civil war, Romans killing other Romans, would be worse than actually giving in to Caesar. That even it would be best to be a slave than to allow a civil war to happen. That's how much he loved the Republic or valued Roman lives. And so when the war did finally break out, incidentally, Cato himself was absolutely shocked. All the accounts agree that Cato was shocked that Caesar crossed the Rubicon and actually pulled a Sulla. He had always thought that Caesar wouldn't actually do it. He always thought that he could play the brinkmanship game with Caesar, because in the final reckoning, Caesar wouldn't do that. But he did. And that's despite Cato being one of the leading voices that always said that Caesar would do something like that Caesar was the sort of man to do that. But when it finally happened, Cato sort of couldn't believe it. But there you go. Never try and call Caesar's bluff. And so when it did actually kick off and they had to leave Rome and they put Pompey in charge of everything, sort of military overall supreme commander, and Pompey's strategic plan was to vacate Rome and Italy. It's a fairly sound plan, really. It's sort of the best thing he could have done, the only thing he could have done. He didn't have legions on hand to fight Caesar immediately. In fact, he did have a couple of legions, but they'd been borrowed freshly, not very long ago, from Caesar. And so he couldn't rely on them to actually stand against Caesar somewhere in northern Italy, somewhere north of Rome. He couldn't rely on them. And that seems like that was a sound call. Any legions that fought under Caesar were almost certainly going to be loyal to him. Caesar was a soldier's soldier. He tended to overpay, if nothing else. And he commanded sort of real loyalty. And so from Cato's point of view, his idea, his strategy, the thing he thought best to do, was just to prolong the war as long as humanly possible. He didn't want to see any battles. In Cato's mind, that was the worst possible thing, the worst possible outcome was for Roman men to be killing other Roman men. If anything could be done to avoid that, then let's try that. That was Cato's thinking. So if he could just prolong the war, the longer he could prolong it, the longer he could put off any battle, the more chance there was of some sort of political arrangement, some sort of deal being struck. That was his hope the whole time. Of course, we know it wasn't possible. But Plutarch says this: after he, Cato, had come to Pompey, he was ever of one mind, namely, to protract the war. For he looked with hope to a settlement of the controversy, and did not wish that the state should be worsened in a struggle, and suffer at its own hands the extreme of disaster, in having its fate decided by the sword. Other measures too, akin to this, he persuaded Pompey and his council to adopt, namely, not to plunder a city that was subject to Rome, and not to put a Roman to death, except on the field of battle. This brought to the party of Pompey a good repute, and induced many to join it. They were delighted with its reasonableness and mildness. End quote. Just to say on that, though, that's what Cato wanted, and only at first that's what Pompey agreed to. Quite quickly, they threw that out. Quite quickly, Pompey started saying things like, if you're not actively with me, you're against me. Caesar played it the other way around. He said, if you're not actively with Pompey, then you can be with me, or you can be a neutral. It's fine. But Pompey went the sort of hard line with it. So even though at first that's what Cato wanted, don't kill any Romans unnecessarily, Pompey very quickly didn't do that. And in fact, the story of the civil war is that the Pompeian faction was unforgiving and they would execute lots of people all the time. And that Caesar, wherever possible, was clement, even overly clement. I'll get into the exact degree of that when I talk about Caesar in detail. So yeah, of the two factions, Pompey's faction was much more steeped in blood, Roman blood. And the war of words starts very quickly as well, because politics doesn't stop as soon as the war started. And Caesar, as well as being a great general, one of the very best to ever do it, was also sort of a very good politician, a very astute politician. And he kept up his verbal tirades against Cato. And Cato did the same against Caesar. Caesar was still criticising Cato's sister and Cato's political decisions and trying to blame Cato for this thing really happening in the first place. And the politicking, the war of words, didn't stop remotely. But when Cato, after his Sicilian sojourn, which I mentioned last time, when he did actually find himself in the camp of Pompey in Greece, he found himself sort of very much out of favour. He was sort of essentially not really needed at this point. Real politics in the forum, in the assemblies and the Senate, that had been done away with now, though. That those avenues had been exhausted. It was full-blown war. And although I mentioned in the first Cato episode he had been a military tribune and he had served and had fought in battles, he was thought of very much as not a military man, and this is outside his purview. And as I say, just not really needed. We've done the political thing. We've exhausted nearly all the political avenues, other than the residual mudslinging, as I say. But all that's really done with. So we don't really need you anymore, Cato. And if anything, Cato, this is Pompey's thinking and the people directly in Pompey's circle, if anything, all you really did was exasperate the problems. Your stubbornness had a fair amount of responsibility in bringing all this about. So he was sort of out of favour to an extent. I mean, he was still absolutely one of the leading lights in the whole Roman world, was absolutely in Pompey's inner circle. But when it came to military, strategic, tactical decisions, he was not in the room, absolutely not in the room. And even when it came to the big strategic decisions, beyond just merely where the battlefield would be and that kind of thing, again, he seems like he wasn't really consulted. Same goes for Cicero. You sort of had your chance, guys. Now leave it to the military men. At one point, Pompey considers, or does very briefly, give the command of all the navies, all the Roman navies, to Cato, or he's just about to. It's not exactly clear whether he actually did or not, but we're told that he was going to, absolutely had the intention of putting all the Roman navies under Cato's command. And a point there is that Pompey controlled all the navies and Caesar essentially had none. But then Pompey changes his mind on that. And we're told that his thinking there was probably that if he should win, if Pompey should beat Caesar in the field, that the second that happens, Cato would revert back to his old view of making sure that no single man was too overly powerful. And if Pompey had just beaten Caesar in a big decisive battle, then Pompey then would become clearly, absolutely, undisputedly the first man of Rome. And Cato wouldn't want that. And so he would probably backstab Pompey right away and use the navies against him. So Pompey decides, oh, wait, actually, no, best not give the command of the navies to Cato because, in the final reckoning, he can't be trusted to not just immediately turn against me. So he gave them to someone else, a Bibulus. But Bibulus was a close kinsman of Cato, though. And may well bend to what Cato wanted. So he's only sort of one step or even half a step removed from being under Cato's control. But nonetheless, that does say something about Pompey's thinking and about how Pompey and his inner military circle, how they viewed Cato, i.e. with a bit of suspicion. We're told a bit all about the Roman navy, how splendid it was and how massive it was. And although things change, it does take many, many years, Caesar really has none. And so that's an interesting point from a strategic point of view, that Caesar was penned into Italy in a way, pretty largely. He was master of the land. Okay, you can conquer and occupy all of Italy, the entire Italian peninsula, and even probably almost certainly be able to hop across to Sicily, so maybe include Sicily in that. But he wouldn't be able to just boat around the entire Mediterranean at will. Only really Pompey had that capacity. And that is a thorn in the side of Julius Caesar. It's a string to his bow he was sort of sorely lacking to begin with. I mentioned last time that when the Optimates and Pompey and everyone fled Rome, they did so quickly and in such a, you can only imagine, something of a panic, that they left the treasury behind, and Caesar could just walk in immediately. Apparently a guard did put up some resistance, saying, you're not legally allowed access to all these funds. And Caesar's supposed to have said something along the lines of, I could have you killed quicker than it would take to order you killed. And the guy just obviously relented. And so Pompey musters a large army. He calls in as many favours as he can from the east. He fled eastwards. He did have armies in Spain, which come up later, and his sons end up commanding armies in Spain. And Caesar has to go to Spain a bit later to defeat those. I'll go into those in another episode. But Pompey himself, the Pompey Magnus, flees eastwards in the first instance into the Balkans, Greece, Epirus, Thrace, that area. And of course, he's the master of the East in all sorts of ways. His clients in the East are almost endless. Everyone in the East, all the magnates and kings and petty kings, they all owe him money and fealty. All of them, gigantic amounts of money. So much money, Dan Carlin tells us, that they're only paying off a fraction of the interest every month that they owe him. And so, in order to work that debt down a bit, they can send him a contingent of men. And he just basically calls in all the favours he possibly can. And he gathers together a large army, a much larger army than Caesar's, like twice as large in infantry, and many times larger in cavalry, and also has a navy. So, on paper at least, Pompey's army is vastly superior to Caesar's. However, in terms of experience, in terms of how veteran they are, how well they're likely to perform in a battle, Caesar's army was much, much better, much, much more seasoned. And everyone knew it. They'd been fighting in Gaul for 10 years, well, professionally. And as I've said many times in Epochs, and I'm sure we'll say many times more, you want quality over quantity when it comes to armies, unless your quantity is truly overwhelming. If you look at the Eastern Front in World War II, if your quantity is absolutely overwhelming, well then, okay, fair enough. In that instance, you want quantity. But if it's anywhere close and you can pick, you want the quality side. And that's what Caesar had. When Caesar did have to cross sort of piecemeal, in a difficult fashion, across the Adriatic to Greece, he had something in the order of 30,000 men. And he was managed to ferry half of them across. And then there was a big storm, and the other half of his men were left on the other side of the Adriatic. So that's terrible. Whenever there's a big set-piece battle in the offering, the worst thing you can do, classically, to the point of cliche, the worst thing you can do is to split your forces. And Caesar's had that done to him against his own will. So tactically, that's a balls up. Tactically, that's a problem. And Pompey's massed his army at a place called Dyrrachium. I'll put a map up so everyone can see exactly what I'm talking about. And the armies first clash at Dyrrachium. Plutarch tells us, quote, when Pompey himself was trying to incite his forces to a battle before Dyrrachium, and bidding each of the other commanders to say something to inspire the men, the soldiers listened to them sluggishly and in silence. But when Cato, after all the other speakers, had rehearsed his genuine emotion, all the appropriate elements to be drawn from philosophy concerning freedom, virtue, death, and fame, and finally passed into an invocation of the gods as eyewitness of their struggle in behalf of their country, there was such a shouting and so great a stir among all the soldiers thus aroused that all the commanders were full of hope as they hastened to confront the peril. End quote. So we are told this, Cicero talks about this as well, that Pompey himself seemed to have lost the magic touch. It's worth noting at this point that Pompey had never lost a battle at this point in his career. Never. He was undefeated. And there's a certain magic that goes with being undefeated. You know, again, even if it's a boxer or an MMA fighter, if you're undefeated, there's a certain mystique about you. Same goes for a military commander. But it seems that Pompey had, maybe he was getting a bit older, but apparently there was no fire in his belly. Cicero talks about how he was lethargic, both actually physically in and of himself, and his thinking. His style of military command was sort of slow and sluggish, and he didn't seem to inspire any real confidence in his own men. He wasn't a paragon of leadership when everyone sort of thought he was. They thought, if anything, that's the one thing Pompey's got in the bag, is that he's a leader of men in the field. And to an almost unparalleled degree, if it comes to a hot war, well, at least we can rely on Pompey for that. But it seemed like he didn't. Well, he didn't. And it trickles down through his senior command and to his men himself. But as we're told there, Cato delivered a great speech. You can rely on Cato to sort of speak from the heart and inspire people. He does that right up to his last days, really. He's a great orator if you're on board with his message, certainly. And so Caesar and Pompey's armies clash at Dyrrhachium. Caesar is heavily outnumbered, and Caesar loses. Now, it's not a complete and utter defeat, wiped out to a man and Caesar killed. Obviously, we know Caesar isn't killed. No spoiler alert there. But it is a reasonably heavy defeat, and Caesar has to flee the field, and Pompey wins the day. And Caesar later said that if Pompey had followed up his win, he, Caesar, would have been wiped out. There wasn't anything he could have done in that moment. But Pompey didn't. He pushed the Caesarian army off the field at Dyrrhachium and then stopped. And we're not sure why. Even ancient historians at the time are not sure why that was. Most say it's because Pompey had become cautious, too cautious. A bit sort of, lethargic in his thinking, in his tactical nous. Maybe he thought it was a trap. Caesar was setting a trap for him. He wasn't. Caesar was just legitimately defeated. But yeah, so if Pompey had followed up there, it would have been all over history. How different history might have been if Pompey had only pushed on after Dyrrhachium. But he didn't, and he allowed Caesar to retain the majority of the survivors, and of course himself to live to fight another day. But it's a real blow for Caesar's morale, Caesar's army, because also they'd been fighting, as I say, for almost 10 years in Gaul. And so although extremely veteran, some have said were also probably a bit threadbare, maybe coming close to having enough. And when they'd lost this first battle at Dyrrhachium, it seemed that it really wounded their pride and morale. They weren't used to losing at all. And of course, it burnishes Pompey's reputation. He's still undefeated, right? He's still got it. That's what everyone thought. He's still got the magic touch. But Caesar's men, the ones that had fled the field at Dyrrhachium, within his rights, Caesar could have dismissed them or executed them or decimated them or something, and they plead for his forgiveness. Because Caesar on the field personally was on the front lines telling the men, don't flee, don't run away. Because, in that moment, that day at Dyrrhachium, it could have been all over. Could very, very easily have been all over. Caesar even apparently tries to physically stop one of the standard bearers, one of the eagle bearers. And the guy just lets Caesar take the eagle and keeps running. And so after the battle, in the debrief, they're begging Caesar for another chance. Please don't disband us. Just give us another shot, coach. We will die to try and save our honour. And Caesar sort of needs every man he can get in the field at this moment. He needs every man jack of them. So he says, okay, I'm not going to decimate you or disband you, but next time you've got to die on your feet if you have to. Take the wounds on the front if you have to. I won't let you get away with that a second time. But although Cato and Cicero and a lot of the Senate, because most of the Senate, most of the Optimate faction, most of the richest people in Rome had all fled with Pompey. There was as many as 300 of them. Nearly all those guys are left behind at Dyrrhachium in the camp. They're not actually on the field of battle. So after the battle's finished, Cato goes out and looks at the battlefield, and he's in tears. He weeps, where everyone else, Pompey and everyone else in the camp, are overjoyed. They're happy. They think they've sort of got the measure of Caesar. They think they've mortally wounded him militarily. They think they've probably won this war straight away. So they're really happy. But Cato, classic contrarian, never goes along with what everyone else is thinking or doing. He's just really sad. Really, really sad, because the last thing he wanted was fellow Romans to get killed, certainly by other fellow Romans. It's terrible for him. For him, it's sort of the end of the Republic in all sorts of ways. It's come to that. Plutarch tells us, quote, "But while all the rest were rejoicing and magnifying their achievements, Cato was weeping for his country and bewailing the love of power that had brought such misfortune and destruction, as he saw that many brave citizens had fallen one by another's hands." End quote. And of course, if you do truly love your country and your own countrymen, there probably are few things worse than seeing the aftermath of a battlefield in a civil war. Really, really harrowing. Everybody's lost, in a sense. But it became clear quite quickly, almost straight away, that Caesar both wasn't completely done as a military force in his own right, and wasn't prepared to treat with Pompey. Cato's grand strategy was that let's try and have a political negotiation to the end of this war at every possible opportunity. If there's any moment when we can stop having battles and start sitting around a table and talking, let's take it. So you would have imagined that Cato would hope that Caesar would now come to the table, so to speak. But he didn't. He wasn't. Caesar had no intention of doing such a thing, even though now he's even more heavily outnumbered than he was before. And the morale of his men has taken a knock. But Caesar's still not prepared to do that. And so I'll let Plutarch continue the story. He says, quote, "When Pompey, in pursuit of Caesar, was breaking camp to march into Thessaly, he left behind him at Dyrrhachium a great quantity of arms and stores, and many kindred and friends. And over all these he appointed Cato commander and guardian, and 15 cohorts of soldiers, because he both trusted and feared him. For in case of defeat, he thought that Cato would be his surest support, but in case of a victory, that he would not, if present, permit him to manage matters as he chose. Many prominent men were also ignored by Pompey and left behind at Dyrrhachium with Cato." And so Pompey marches out to the next big battle, the main decisive battle between Pompey himself and Caesar. These civil wars go on for quite a few more years. But the main one, where Pompey is CO on the ground, commander of all the forces, is Pharsalus. It's really the definitive battle. And I'll talk about that in great detail when I talk about Pompey and Caesar. But just to say, quick overview, Pompey had something like 40 or 50,000 men, infantry. Caesar had something like 22,000 men. So again, probably something in the order of 2 to 1. Pompey had something like 7,000 or 8,000 cavalry. Caesar had something like 1,000 cavalry. So completely outmatched in terms of cavalry. So much so that it was kind of obvious what Pompey should do, and therefore how Caesar could counter it. So if you've got a massive advantage in men and cavalry, a great tactic to do is you do a massive all-out cavalry charge that's irresistible. If they've only got 1,000 cavalry, you sweep those off the field, and then you smash your cavalry into their infantry, break them up, kill quite a few, and then it's simplicity itself for your infantry to mop up. But that was sort of so obvious that Caesar saw it coming and put countermeasures in place and was able to deny Pompey that cavalry win which is exactly what he did, exactly how it played out at Pharsalus. And I'll tell you all about it in detail next time. Basically, the bottom line is Pompey was out-generalled that day by Julius Caesar. Completely out-generalled. And Pompey didn't even want to do that. He knew that he had Caesar beaten in any sort of long game. He could sort of starve Caesar out. He had all the money and men and materiel on his side. He could wait Caesar out until Caesar was in dire, dire straits. But the Senate in exile and all sorts of pressures were put on Pompey to finish this thing quickly. They didn't want to wait for months until Caesar's men were extremely thirsty and hungry and dying of exposure and things. They didn't want to wait for months for that to happen. If anything, they thought it was dishonourable as well as just sort of boring. So they put more and more pressure on Pompey to sort of offer battle to Caesar, which was the wrong thing to do. They could have just waited, but they didn't. And Pompey actually delivers a speech saying that, saying, okay, I'm going to do a battle. I'm going to offer Caesar battle, but I'm doing it because you're forcing my hand to. Remember that. You know, if we do lose, it's on you. But we shouldn't lose because I'm Pompey Magnus and I've never lost a battle. So hopes were high. But Caesar wins the day because Caesar's a superb tactician. Plutarch continues. When the defeat at Pharsalus came, Cato resolved that if Pompey were dead, he would take over to Italy those who were still with him. He would himself live in exile as far as possible from the tyranny of Caesar. If, on the contrary, Pompey were alive, he would by all means keep his forces intact for him. Accordingly, having crossed over to Corcyra, where the fleet was, he offered to give up the command to Cicero, who was of consular rank, while he himself had only been a praetor. But Cicero would not accept the command and set out for Italy. Then Cato, seeing that the younger Pompey's actually got a couple of sons, there's a Gnaeus and a Sextus, seeing that the younger Pompey, I believe it's the Gnaeus Pompey, was led by his obstinacy and unseasonable pride into a desire to punish all those who were about to sail away, and was going to lay violent hands on Cicero first of all, admonished him in private and calmed him down, thus manifestly saving Cicero from death and procuring immunity for the rest. End quote. So just to say on Cicero at this point, after Pharsalus, Cicero sort of sees the writing on the wall and is prepared to just hand himself over to Caesar. He's not prepared to fight on and on and on, deeper into the east or in Spain or in Africa. He's not going to run away anymore. He's going to give himself up to Caesar. And if Caesar wants to kill him, which of course he didn't because Caesar's very clement, and not just clement, but for big names, for big faces, he loves to pardon them. He loves it. So Cicero made that calculation correctly, that he would be allowed to live and even continue his political career back in Rome, albeit with a touch of shame that he has to bend the knee to the sort of now undisputed tyranny, for want of a better word, of Julius Caesar. But that's Cicero all over, you know, he's a pragmatist. He bends with the wind, which is exactly what Cato doesn't ever do.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.